Chagatai line of Genghis Khan's family had received the Ulis consisting of the former Karachitai Empire stretching east of Lake Balkhash, including the whole Tarim Basin, as well as Transoxania and Afghanistan. Their empire had a predominantly Turkish population, and there the traditions of the steppe remained much stronger than in the contemporary Mongol Empire in China. The civilization of the Muslim oasis dwellers influenced the nomadic character of the Chagatai Empire, only to a very limited degree, and the expansionist tendencies inherited from the earlier rulers made themselves repeatedly felt. The history of the Chagatai Empire seems rather confused because there are few reliable sources. Even the reign dates of the Khans cannot always be ascertained. From 1267 to 1301 the Chagatai Empire was subject to Ogedei's descendant Kaidir, and it was only after the fall of the latter that the Chagatai Khans regained their independence. In foreign policy, the Chagatai Empire was notable for its continuous attempts to conquer India, by way of Afghanistan and the Punjab plain. The conquest of India had been one of the aims of Genghis himself, but was soon abandoned in favor of other campaigns. The Chagatai rulers on various occasions sent their armies through Afghanistan into India, chiefly because on all other frontiers relatively stable states the Yuan Empire in the east, and the Tukhan state in the west prevented a policy of aggression. This left the south as the only promising direction of attack. For several decades the Mongols remained a dangerous enemy for the Muslim sultans of Delhi. The Mongol invasions from Afghanistan became particularly fierce under Dua Khan 1301 to 1305, and the Delhi Sultan al-3/4 al-D+N Khalj+ was able to defend his capital only with great difficulty against the Chagatai expeditionary forces. The situation of Islam had, in spite of the conversion of earlier Khans, remained precarious. When, after a short period of internal stability, 1301 to 1325, the Khan Tarmashirin again adopted Islam, 1326, there followed a temporary division between the eastern and western parts of his empire. Some sources even state that Tarmashirin was murdered by the adherents of Buddhism and shamanism because of his conversion to Islam. Under Tughlaq Temur, 1347 to 1363, the empire was reunified, but his successors were mere puppets. Actual power lay in the hands of the Emir Timur, Tamerlane, 1336 to 1405, who continued the Chagatai rule, although he was not a Mongol himself. Turkish influence had become very strong during the 14th century, but Mongol was still used as an official language in the Turfan region as late as 1369. In Timur's reign, however, the Chagatai Ulis had effectively ceased to be a Mongol empire, and had become a Turkish and Islamic state. Nevertheless, there remain to this day traces of Mongol rule over Afghanistan. The Mughal people still speak a Mongol dialect, with some archaic features, dating back to the period of the Mongol conquest in the 13th century. Persian supplanted Mongol and, to a certain degree, even Turkish as the official and literary language. Another kingdom which, though ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan, must be regarded as basically Turkish, was that of the Shaybnid dynasty. Shayban, the son of Juchi and the grandson of Genghis, ruled over the territories east and southeast of the Ural Range. One of his descendants, Abulkair, reigned 1428 to 1468, made himself ruler of the Turkish Uzbeks. His grandson Mupercent Ahmed Shayban Plus took Bukhara and Herti from the Timurids, and his descendants continued to rule in Bukhara until 1599. Other branches of the same family, such as the Nagi Khans and the Astrakhan Khans, ruled over parts of Transcaspia. All of these states were Mongol only, insofar as their sultans were patrilineal descendants of Genghis. Otherwise they showed no Mongol features at all. Their language was Turkish, their culture Islamic with a strong admixture of Persian elements. The Khanate of Khiva was from 1512 in the hands of the Shaybnids, and its last Khan, Abdullah, was deposed by the Soviet government as late as 1920, although Russian domination had already been established over the whole region in the 1860s and 1870s. Final decline of Mongol power in China, and the chaotic conditions during Togun Temur's reign were but one of the many times of trouble in Chinese history. There was widespread unrest which often took the form of local rebellions against the Mongol authorities. The reasons for this development were chiefly economic, and it was, as usual in China, in the countryside, that insurgents first ventured their attacks on the local administration. The situation of the peasantry was in many areas desperate. Small farmers and tenants had to shoulder the burden of excessive taxation and coerced duties. The arbitrariness of Mongol nobles and officials caused general resentment among all Chinese. It appears that the Mongol ruling class was never able to establish satisfactory relations with the agricultural population of China. Their lack of sympathy for agricultural problems was also reflected in the Mongol legislation on hunting. The peasants were forbidden to protect their crops against game animals, and had moreover to assist the Mongols in hunting expeditions which invariably caused great damage in the fields. In the large towns, relations between Mongols and Chinese were usually better than in the countryside. Conditions became particularly strained in 1351, when the government proceeded to carry out an enormous plan for water conservation in the Huanghe, Yellow River, region, which had been suffering from catastrophic floods. The leaders of local rebellions came without exception from the lower strata of society. They included salt smugglers, petty officials, sectarian leaders, monks, and shamans. In the southeastern provinces, agriculturally the richest, and therefore most ruthlessly exploited region of the whole empire, rebellions were particularly numerous. The province of Zhejiang had for centuries been the greatest rice surplus area, and Beijing, with its sizable population, had always been dependent on supplies from this region. When the lines of communication between north and south were cut by rebellions, the situation in the capital became precarious. The paper money on which the currency was based became entirely valueless, and the treasury was soon depleted. This again impaired the military efforts of the government. It is a remarkable feature of the history of these years that at first the various rebellions, occurring independently of each other, were not motivated by nationalist feeling among the oppressed peasants, but were directed against the upper classes regardless of their nationality. Contemporary sources provide abundant evidence that the Chinese gentry had as much to fear from the insurgents as had the Mongols. This explains why so many Chinese continued to assist the government. They apparently preferred the harsh rule of the foreigners to the violent popular movements of their compatriots. These rebels committed atrocities which for a number of years proved a great obstacle to a more widespread uprising. Gradually, however, more and more educated Chinese were won over to the cause of the rebels, who in their turn learned from them how to tackle the problems of administration and warfare. The most successful rebel leader was the former monk Xu Chengde. Born to a family of poor peasants, he showed more energy, patience, and military talent than his rivals. He succeeded not only in establishing himself firmly in the key economic areas, but also in eliminating his rivals in the struggle for power. Xu finally drove the Mongols out of Beijing, 1368, and made himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Ming. He adopted the reign name Hongwu, and, assisted by able generals, extended his rule over the whole of northern China by 1359. Mongol provincial commanders in the southwest continued their resistance, however, and Ming power was not established there until much later. Sichuan, 1371, Yunnan, 1382, the last Mongol emperor, Togun Temur, fled into the steppes and died there in 1370. Thus ended more than a century of Mongol rule over China. The Mongols' defeat cannot, however, be attributed to degeneracy or corruption, but the mollifying influences of life in a highly civilized Chinese atmosphere. Subsequent events showed that the Mongols had lost nothing of their military vigor, and they remained a menace to the northwest Chinese frontier. The realization of this potential danger possibly made the Hongwu Emperor at first establish his capital not in Beijing, which was more or less a frontier town, but in the heart of China, in Nanjing, where he had set up his residence already in 1364. Xu Chengde's rise to imperial power and the re-establishment of Chinese rule led to the elimination of political and economic activity not only among the Mongols, but also among the many non-Mongol foreigners who had held office or made fortunes as merchants under the Mongols. Those foreigners who chose to stay in China changed their family names and gradually became assimilated. Foreign religions such as Islam and Christianity lost their privileges. Christianity was in fact completely wiped out as a consequence of the strong nationalist feelings of the Chinese. General impact of Mongol domination over China is difficult to assess. The suspension of literary examinations, the exclusion of Chinese from higher offices, and the resulting frustration of the former ruling class of scholar officials led to a sort of intellectual eremitism. Traditional forms of Chinese literature and art continue to be practiced by a class which was barred from participation in political affairs. The only branches of the civil service where the cooperation of educated Chinese was absolutely indispensable had been those concerned with ritual and historiography. The Mongol language never wholly replaced Chinese as the medium for historiography or for official documents, and most of the inscriptions surviving from the Mongol period are bilingual. Chinese literary life remained remarkably free, perhaps because the ruling minority was indifferent to, or even unable to read, what their subjects wrote in Chinese. It is surprising to see how freely Chinese writers after 1280 expressed their national, loyalist, and anti-Mongol feelings. The period of Mongol rule over China is, in the field of literature, also marked by a considerable output of drama and of popular novels, written in the vernacular. This phenomenon is, however, not directly connected with Mongol rule, for it is difficult to visualize a Mongol audience in front of a Chinese stage. A social cause, the growing influence and prominence of the merchant class, may have been instrumental. The traders and merchants were among the very few groups in the population who actually benefited from Mongol rule. Another such group comprised the priests of non-Chinese religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, who enjoyed the exemption from taxes which was customary in China for the Buddhist, and, to a lesser extent, the Taoist clergy. The Mongols themselves, at least at court, gave up their traditional forms of worship, and became to a great extent converts to Tibetan Buddhism, which was already flourishing in China under Kublai Khan. The growing influence of Tibetan Buddhism can be seen in the increasing number of Mongols who were given Buddhist names derived from Tibetan. Chinese Buddhism, on the other hand, remained on the whole hostile toward the Tibetan clergy, who were despised not only for their creed, but also for being a favored ally of the invaders. Furthermore, many Chinese Buddhist monasteries were strongholds of Chinese traditional culture. The same is true of Taoism. Although the Taoist clergy had originally been granted the same privileges as the Buddhists, the Taoist religion had already under Kublai begun to suffer from official persecution, chiefly perhaps because the Buddhist clergy regarded Taoism as a dangerous rival, and because Taoist sects and monasteries were, not without justification, looked on as centers of secret activities and unbridled nationalism. All things considered, it may safely be said that Chinese civilization as a whole was influenced surprisingly little by Mongol rule. It was, however, responsible for a certain deviation from accepted standards of ethical behavior, as far as the law and government were concerned. The autocratic and totalitarian features of China under the Ming dynasty are perhaps to be attributed to the fact that the country had been under barbarian rule for more than a century. The Mongols themselves, taken as a group, remained largely aloof from Chinese culture. A number became proficient Chinese scholars, however, and their poems and calligraphy were on par with native Chinese. The later emperors, after some initial efforts under Kublai, encouraged translations from Chinese into Mongol, and the earliest specimens of printing in Mongol were produced in China. Most of these translations are now lost as a consequence of Ming nationalism, but the few existing fragments, mostly Buddhist texts, are of the highest importance for the history of the Mongol language. The Mongols were expelled from China soon after, 1368. For the next 2 centuries they lived in Mongolia just as they had before their conquests. A warlike nomad people with only a few traces of their long sojourn among the Chinese.